Hi. Okay, let's see if I can coordinate this with the video. Good morning. It's Tuesday morning, and had a very busy guy. I'm doing in the middle of this lecture series on the power of the basins down the ages, so I'm very tenumen. However, I do want to do the history podcast today, which is being sponsored by Henry Rosenberg. Time ago, he actually has 2 yard sites. Last week and this week, 16 Tammuz, which was his mom, Branas Bas Chaim, and 25 Tammuz, that's any day now, is Shalom Ben Yitzchak, his father, Shalom Ben Yitzchak. So thank him for the sponsorships. And I'll tell you the truth, I had to draw a blank. With me, it goes by whatever is on your mind. And for some reason, I just had a blank. I didn't know who to talk about. And then Ari Album sent me a list of names. And one of them was the Yeven Metzulah, Nosson Hanover, the author of the Yeven Metzulah, which is about the exile Tachbatat. I said, I've done that already. But then it came to my mind the following thought, and that's what I want to do this morning. And that is maybe locate Nathan Hanover, this chronicler, this historian, within the broad frame of what I would call Frum history books. So I want to give a little talk this morning, not comprehensive. It's not a lecture, on quote-unquote the Frum history books. And what I mean by that are the chronicles that have been Mekubal and Klal Yisrael, as you almost say, almost part of Torah literature. Once upon a time, even today, but less so, most of you probably don't know this, once upon a time, the Frum library included a certain number of history books. Now, they're not what we call nowadays modern history, but it was expected that every Moskil should be familiar with these works. That's how you know your Jewish history. When I say the word Moskil, I don't mean in the modern sense, but in the old sense. So the Vilna Gaon is a Moskil and read all these books and was familiar with them. The Satmarov, the Ramah, the Rambam, you see what I'm saying? Like that. These are the quote-unquote the Mekubal books in Klal Yisrael. And I don't think most people are familiar with the library of them. I want to make a few remarks this morning to locate the Yeven Metzulah, which is about the exile Tachbatat, within this framework. It's one of those famous books that Klal Yisrael reads. So, in general, if you want to know, those of you who are listening are probably interested in Jewish history to some degree or another, what are the books out there? So the truth of the matter is we're living in late in 21st century. There's an entire field of Jewish history, Jewish studies as they call the universities, and there's a ton of literature coming out all the time. Naturally, a guy who never started is not going to be able to master all that stuff. That requires a full-time specialty commitment. However, every one of you out there who's a Moskil in the old sense, I repeat, in the old sense, the Frum sense, let's put it that way, ought to be familiar to some degree or another with the classics of Jewish old history, even though they're not the final word in the subject. They're not necessarily all accurate. They're highly this and that and the other, all of which is true. Having said that, an educated Jew, I'll say an educated Torah Jew, is supposed to be familiar with this stuff. You see? It doesn't replace Daf Yomi, but nevertheless, it's what's there. Most people aren't familiar with the library. Therefore, I'm going to touch on a fair number of the classics. Now, right off the bat, you should know there's this golden oldie about 100 and some years ago, which is republished from once in a while, which I have in my hand over here. So those today who are watching the video have a tiny bit of advantage over those listening in the audio. You can see it yourself because I'm going to do a little bit of show and tell. Not a lot, but a little. There's a golden oldie by a Moskil from Odessa named Avraham Kahana that he was talking not from about 120 years ago, in which he did exactly what I said, which is he collected in 2 volumes, as you see over here, right? Something called Sifrut HaHistoria HaYisraeli. It's very good. And he did precisely what I'm talking about, which is HaSifrut HaHistoria HaYisraeli means the Israel or the Jewish historical literature. He doesn't mean in the modern sense, but in the old classic sense, and I'm talking about this morning. So as you can see over here in the table of contents, he has a nice list. I'm not doing all of them at all. Of what are the Jewish historical sources that are out there? The chroniclers from the old times. Okay? And Megillus Times, he starts with the Seder Olam, Megillus HaChashmonai, and this and that and the other. Okay? And this is, if those of you who are players and want to be players, you might hear I'm putting it up on the screen. Avraham Kahana, Sifrei Historia Israeli. Maybe it's on Hebrew books, I don't know. And he has a doggone good collection or selection of all the classic works of Jewish historiography. However, they're not necessarily total. If it's a small piece, he'll have the whole piece in there. Why not? If it's a larger, he'll just have excerpts. Okay? So for our purposes today, and again, I'm not trying to do a university course over here, but just to acquaint the listeners of this podcast, this video, but a general taste of what's called classic old, I'll use this term, Frum historiography, the old days. So when it comes, now we're in the 3 weeks, and one of the oldest is this over here, what I hold in my hand, called Josephus, which you see now is you can get in 2 volumes, as I have it, with Nekudos, right? That's why I got in Israel years ago. Now, listen closely. Josephus is not part of the old library. Josephus is. Josephus is not considered Frum. Josephus is considered Frum. Now, that has nothing to do with the fact of whether Josephus is accurate or not, or the Josephus is not accurate. Those are separate discussions. But a Frum Jew, once upon a time, like I say, the Vilna Gaon, the Satmar Rebbe, I'm serious about this. The Baal Shem Tov, anybody. You have a Gemara set, you have a Mikras Gedolah set. One of the things you have is the Josephus. I mean that very seriously. Right? And during the 3 weeks, you used to pull this out, and that's where you read about the Churban Beis HaMikdash, the wars with the Romans and all that business. What's the relationship between Josephus and Josephus? This is like a Frum knockoff of Josephus. But as I said before, I don't want to get into this in detail. I'm simply trying to tell you that it's a Frum thing. So all the Rishonim Achronim did this. That during this time of the year, of course you read Kamsa bar Kamsa. Yes, that's true. The famous Gemaras and all that. If you're a little wider, you might read the Medashechad, whatever. But you also want to read Josephus. And that's where the Frum Jew of yesteryear got all of his historical knowledge of the details of the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Okay? Now, that's one. I made a little list here for myself, again, on purpose, not a comprehensive list, but a broad one to locate this within a wider framework. After Josephus, which is composed really in the Byzantine era, to tell you the truth, when the Jews owned the Byzantine Empire, one of the very early sources out there is what you call over here, I hold in my hand, Megillus Achimatz, which again I picked up in Israel years ago as a Menukud. Megillus Achimatz would be from the Byzantine period. There it tells you it's a famous source of stories, true, not true, whatever, of stories of the famous rabbis that were in the Eastern Roman Empire, having to do with in Greece and what you today call Asia Minor, Turkey, and famous rabbis and stuff like that. They're famous from this book. Okay? So the Frum Jew is supposed to know Josephus. If you live after 1800, Megillus Achimatz. I'll hold it up so you can see it. Megillus Achimatz. Okay? And there's also a classic source. The next one that comes to mind is the Sefer HaKabbalah. That already takes you into the Spain in the Middle Ages, time of the Rishonim, by the Ravid, not the Ravid, but the Ravid. The person who wrote this is not identical with the Ravid, who's the commentary in the Rambam, the critic of the Rambam, but it's another Ravid. And he was a chronicler and a historian. That's where you get a lot of the information that we've heard. He's the one who tells the stories about Tanoim, Amroim. Afterwards, some of the stuff is wild and crazy. Mama's crazy over there. But if you want to know the history of the Jews in Spain up to his time, he lived when the Arabs were still ruling Spain, before the Almohads. So he has all the stories of Chasdim and Shaprut, and Moshe ben Chanoch, and Shmuel HaNogid, and so forth and so on. That's where you get the stories from. It's the Sefer HaKabbalah. I didn't bring it in front of him on the table yet. but it's there. These are I'll tell you again, these are things that our avos and avos used to read. Okay? That's where they actually got the information about the Geonim and Rishonim, especially in that time. So I just gave you 3 titles. The Yosifan, the Megillas Achimatz, and the Sefer HaKabbalah. Another famous one, which is very appropriate for this time of the year, is out of Spain also, and that's called the Shevet Yehuda. Right? I don't think I ever did him. From Shlom ben Vergab, and really, it's like 3 generations wrote it. If you want to get into it, you'll look it up yourself. And again, I have this wonderful edition I pick up all the time, as you see, with Manuka and everything. And this is the story of the troubles in Spain in 1492, but also many troubles beforehand. He also talks about certain gezeros, sufferings that the Jews had in other countries. And indeed, not surprisingly, when you get to these kind of books, which is a genre in the Middle Ages, a lot of it is bad, sad stuff. Talking about Corbins, gezeros, expulsions, blood libels, and all kinds of junk that the Jews were suffering, because this was the Metzias in the Middle Ages. But if you want the classic stories, I mean really classic stories of what you call 1492, the expulsion of the Jews in Spain, but also from 1391, the pogroms against the Jews in Spain, the Frum book of yesteryear was the Shevet Yehuda. This is one of those books mentioned by the Mishnah Brura, which is that you're allowed to read on Shabbos. Because the Shulchan Aruch says, you shouldn't read his, I didn't make it up. Yosef Kara said you shouldn't read history books on Shabbos. Right? But, you know, the Mishnah Brura was a Frum guy, so I guess, but these kind of books you can read. Because they're Musar and Yerushalayim, all that kind of stuff. Okay? And there's some pretty horrifying stories of the sufferings of the Jews in 1492. These are the Sephardim Tahorim. He's interested in those Jews who gave everything up and left the country, Baro v'choser kol, and were ripped off along the way and tortured and raped and murdered, leaving Spain. And he's got all the mices over there. So you have, again, you have the Yosifan, you got the Megillas Achimatz, you have the Sefer HaKabbalah from the Ravid, and you have the Shevet Yehuda. Okay? When the Jews left Spain, this left a big Rosham on them, and it's in 1492, and that is the period when, in Western culture, you had the Renaissance in Italy, and part of the Renaissance was the rediscovery of an interest in history. It's not the only part, but it's a part. So notice history became a part of philosophy at that time. And you have, I don't want to give you all the Geisha names, Guicciardini, Vico, and so forth. We have an interest in getting at the past. And this is picked up by the Jews in their way, because that's often what happens. We knock at what the Goyim are doing, but we're doing it in our own way. I'm talking about the Frum world now. And therefore, there came out a whole bunch of books of history among the Jews in Italy or Spain or places like that. One of the classics is the Sefer HaYuchsin, okay? The Sefer HaYuchsin from Abba Zakuto, which I happen to hold in my hand in English. See that? Those of you who have trouble, I picked this up some time ago. It's a classic in Hebrew, but I got here to translate the whole Sefer HaYuchsin in English. There are whole pieces in here that he has from the Jewish past. By the way, he has the Tanaim and Amoraim, the way he understands them. And he also has, if I remember correctly, other pieces like the history of the Zohar and the controversies around the history of the Zohar. He has over here a version of the Ger Shri Gun, which is considered a classic text of the Ger Shri Gun. And he's got a lot to do over here with your Tanaim Amoraim. Okay, but he also has afterwards. So the Sefer HaYuchsin, which is not simply about Yichus, but it's about history, is a classic of Jewish historiography of the old school. And again, everybody had this Sefer. I'll go back what I said before, the Ramah, the Vilna Gaon, the Marsha, you name it. This is something they had in their library. And this is where they got their information from, right or wrong. Okay. Another book that comes out from that time, of this type, he actually wrote several books of this sort, is Sad. You understand? Sad. That's from Rabbi Yosef HaKohen Harofe. And one of them is a classic called Emek HaBacha. And the Emek HaBacha, the Valley of Tears, is all about Gezeros. And he is listing all sorts of persecutions and sufferings and shchitas and redifas that the Jews suffered down the ages, particularly in his time. He describes the burning of the Gemaras by the Pope. He was there. And it's written in a very classic biblical style. Vahibi may so-and-so, but Vahibi may ha-pifyor, the Pope. And being in Italy, he was very familiar with all the different gezeros and persecutions by the different popes and the different dukes and princes and rulers that most people not even familiar with, if not for the fact that he did. This guy busted in the Jewish quarter and burned a bunch of books, and he attacked so and so many women, and so forth, in Bologna. So if you want to know, particularly, I mean in general, but particularly about stuff that the Jews underwent in Italy, not only, but in Italy, in his time, the classic source that our avos and avos they always have a copy of Emek HaBacha. Right? They always have a copy of Emek HaBacha. He wrote other books. I remember he wrote a general history book, believe it or not. If I remember the history of the kings of Turkey, kings of France as well. Now, these are all very Frum people, but they had the history bug. And therefore, this is a subject that fascinated them. And it's part of what I said before, the Torah library. The Torah library. Now, another book would be the Shalshelet HaKabbalah, which is also from that time. For some reason, it got very strongly attacked. They call Shalshelet HaShaker. Maybe some of the stories are a bunch of bull, but maybe not. It's complicated. And the Shalshelet HaKabbalah from Gedalia has a lot of mises about Big Rabbanan in his time, some of which have gotten out there in the general Jewish knowledge or not. I don't have it with me, but then I think in the Kahana book, they probably have all or most of it, the Shalshelet HaKabbalah. And when he says the word Kabbalah, he means history over there. And he's interested in the story of the rabbis. I remember he has all these mises about these Gedolim, like the Mari ben Lev or something, who were beaten up by their Balabatim and all kind of business like that. But as you can see, he has about Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Ibn Ezra, the Rambam and Rashi, which is not a true story. The Rasham Rabbeinu Tam, the Rivom, the Ramban, and so on and so forth. He has the story of the Nasana Tokov guy, the famous one that we all heard of. And all I can tell you is that this was, became a classic. There's also the Kori Hadoras, which I don't have in front of me, from Conforte. These are all people who live in Spain, that era, after the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. And they're interested, trying to locate their current reality by comparing it to the past, because that is what you do in history. One of the things about history is it helps you locate the present. If I say to you, who are you? As I always tell my students, you can give all kind of answers. You can give a scientific answer. I'm a Homo sapiens. I got 2 eyeballs and a nose and teeth and all that, all of which is true. But when I want to know who are you, what I'm really asking is, how relate your present to your past. Where are you? Are you from Baltimore? Are you from somewhere else? Where's your family come from? Where'd you go to school? I want to know your history so I can locate you this way. That's how these guys thought. Okay, that's how these guys thought. So you have, as I say before, the Shalshelet HaKabbalah. Another classic from those days is Sefer Debei Eliyahu, from Eliyahu Kapsali from Crete. Again, I don't have it in front of me. But he has pieces of it over here. And he had the history, very interesting, the history of the yeshivas in Italy, especially if you want to find out about the Volozhin of Italy, which was, in Padua. And he learned during that yeshiva. He describes the style of the shiur and the learning and the pilpul, as he said, you have to wave your hands, he says, and things like that. And again, it's a golden old, it's a classic of Eliyahu Kapsali. And I don't know if that one circulated as much as the others, but it's a classic of that style. There is again, another one from that period. We have Emek HaBacha, the Shalshelet HaKabbalah, the chroniclers, and I do have chroniclers here. Excuse me. Yeah, I do have that up front. Oh, very good. So this is the size of it. And as I said before, W become 40. Here you'd have all about the among other things, he tells you who wrote all this Frum and what kind of tzaddikim they were. Let's put it back. All these Maisalach. Okay. Then you have an Ashkenazi classic, which is unusual because you usually have much Ashkenazim, and that's this. The Tzemach David, who was David Gans, a Talmud of the Ramah, but he also was a scientist, and he hung around some of the famous astronomers of his time because he was from Prague, and he's in the time of the Maral, and the Talmud of Maral actually, also, and in his time, believe it or not, Prague was the capital of the German Empire. It was the seat of the emperor, the headquarters of science, the most advanced science was in Prague in his time, and he was totally into it. And he wrote, and part of his, so in other words, I'm talking about a Moscow of the 16th century, and therefore he was a Talmud Chacham, and he learned and all that stuff. He also was interested in history, and clearly he was interested in secular history. Now, I would say he might be the first guy of this type who wants to locate, as I do sometimes in these podcasts, what's happening in Jewish history within the context of what's happening in world history. Therefore, he has two parts, the Goyish history part and the Jewish history part. Okay? He has about the history of Pilpul and all kind of things like that. And he has the Seder of, the Tanoim, Amroim, Rabbanos Avraham, and all the rest of it. And it's a famous, and by the way, he has a lot of hashoros, guesses. They're wild and crazy. It doesn't mean it's correct. Later on in the 20th century, the Derez Hashem goes after him a bunch of times. They don't like his approach. But that doesn't matter. I'll say it again. This is part of the Old Torah Library. I have the fancy edition from Professor Mordechai Breuer, who's a Yeki, who was interested in this sort of thing. And he's got Roman history of there they got from the Roman books. Because you see, in Prague in his time, they had tremendous science and good libraries. And to know history once upon a time meant the classics. History was the history of the Greeks and the Romans. And so, in the same way that I'm describing for you today, the basic books out there that an educated Jew was supposed to know. If you want to know anything about Jewish history, let's say I'm talking about 2 dozen books at the most, less. So similarly, if you want to know the Roman history or the Greek history, there were again 1 2 dozen, 3 dozen books in total. And if you read those books, you know everything there is to know at that time. In other words, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, those kind of guys. Tacitus, Suetonius, this, you read them all. In other words, it's a doable project. So if somebody wanted to know all there was about Roman history, you might say like this, why talk of the Romans? That was what was out there. That was considered a classical education. Nobody knew about it, was interested, or gave a fig for Chinese history, Indonesian history, and all the rest of it, even though from a modern perspective, it's very racist. Okay, so it was. So this is the world over there. Now he wants to, and by the way, the Jews didn't live in Indonesia and in China. The Jews lived among the Romans and Greeks. So that would interest the Tzemach David. So in addition to his astronomy books, he wrote this famous history or chronicle book, which is a classic of the Frum library. Everybody knows about the Tzemach David. What I'm trying to say is like this. You'll be surprised. You'll look in Charles and Tuba sometimes. I mean, from the Frum to the Frum, and they'll say, oh, Kamosha Kosu, there's so-and-so and say over there. Now, I forgot to bring in here, maybe it's unconscious or conscious, the most controversial of the books of this nature was, of course, Azaria de Rossi, who I have in the other room, who wrote the Moreh Nine. Azaria de Rossi, I did a lecture on, it should be online somewhere, when I did the 7 famous historians. It's a lecture series I did a long time ago. It's on the video. I don't know if it's on the audio or not. And he was a rabbi in northern Italy. He wrote a first attempt at a modern history book in which he critiques the old histories, and including he also critiques the Gemaras, I might say. And so when it says, for example, the bug went up the nose of Titus, that's famous for Tisha B'Av. The bug goes up the nose of Titus in the famous story in the Gemara. Eventually drives him crazy and kills him. And he's the whole thing, is that true story or not? Because we now have records of this in the Romans. And Titus died in a different way, and so on and so forth. And he is the guy who provoked the Maharal of Prague to write a book all against him. The Maharal's book is the Be'er Hagolah. So that's already a famous book of yesteryear, which was controversial. So I don't know if the Vilna Gaon had it. We know that Tosas Yontiv and a whole bunch of other people had it, the Yaakov Emden, and they do quote from it, as the Yaakov Emden says, Lo tisa'ev Adomi ki achichahu. So in other words, Adomi is Azaria de Rossi, Adom, red, Rossi. And what he meant by that is, like we say today, listen, the book has some bad parts in it, but also has good parts. So that's a little bit of a different sort of thing. I don't believe the Mishnah Berurah would say, oh, it's okay to read Azaria de Rossi on Shabbos. But all these other books I mentioned, the Mishnah Berurah would be totally fine with. So I'm just trying to tell you, we have a tradition of a certain type of historiography. In modern times, we call these chronicles. That's the modern historians making fun of them. Chronicles. Because they don't have footnotes, they don't have a comparison. It's usually not critical. And the last of these, for our purposes today, or maybe the next to the last, is the person whose yard site is this week. That's Nosson Hanover, who wrote, of course, the Tach B'Tach, the Yeven Metzulah, which is my copy with the Gudas I gave out to somebody and she'll ask me to borrow it this week, which I'm happy to do. And this tells you all the story in close detail of the Cossack massacres. Now, is all of it accurate, not accurate? It's any other historians are debating this down today. It's pretty good. But this became the source. And if you real Frum, when it comes Chaf Sivan, or the 3 weeks, people will whip this out and go through all the stories of the Cossack, Khorban, and so forth and so on, of the Xeris Takwatat, 1648, 1649. And especially they would read with sadness his elegiac descriptions of the golden age of the Jews in Poland, which is destroyed by the Cossack massacres. When the Klal Yisrael had it good in Poland, the way he describes it, had yeshivas and money, shidduchim and yichas and blah, blah, blah. The whole thing. So this is a classic piece. The title here is Xeris Takwatat, but really it's Yeven Metzulah. To be perfectly honest, this edition I have has more than the Yeven Metzulah. It has a few others that I've mentioned from time to time. It also has the Tzoko Itim and the Megillah Seifa. The Megillah Seifa is from the Shach I did a couple weeks ago. I read pieces of it. And the Tzoko Itim is from that time. But the Yeven Metzulah is the classic. So these are all the books of that library. I'll throw in one more. Maybe the last of this genre, possibly. That would be from the 18th century. And that's this golden oldie. The Seder Hadoros, which I don't think has been put into a fancy edition. And that's from the time of the Shagasaryeh, from Yechiel Halpern in Minsk. He was actually the Bar Plukta with the Shagasaryeh. And he is interested in trying to locate all the Tanaim Amoraim. He basically collects from all the literature that I said beforehand. And it became a classic, you might say, of Jewish historiography. It is very far from perfect. There's a guy living in Minsk in the 18th century without too much access to other stuff. But he has all your Rishonim, Yachronim. Look, I'm just pulling at a page, Elav HaChamishi, the current millennium that we're in now. And, of course, you got all your Rishonim over here, but he also has, in different parts, all the Tanaim Amoraim, and who they were when they lived, and so on and so forth. like these other books before, and they became a golden oldie. Since I'm in the 18th century, I would also make, so everybody has a Seder Adoros. Right or wrong, everybody would have this sefer. And while I'm there, I would just throw in the Chidah's famous, what's it called? Shem HaGadolim. I didn't bring it in. I'm not going to go in the other room and bring it in. Where he has, of course, 2 volumes. One listing alphabetically all the famous Frum, and the other one listing alphabetically all the famous Mechabrim. That's really good mainly for your late Rishonim and Achronim. And these were that pretty much wraps up, I would say, the classic history library of the Frum Jew of Once Upon a Time. Between those titles I just mentioned before, there are a couple titles here and there, but a little too detailed for our treatment. Between these was the library that the Frum Jew Once Upon a Time turned to and accessed and pulled out from if he wanted to find about the past. So now's the 3 weeks where we're doing Tisha B'Av is around the corner. So the average guy will pull out the Yosef Fun. You get it? If it's a little bit more interesting, he might pull out one of these other things, but they're mainly copying from the Yosef Fun. If he wants to locate in a wider range, he might pull out the Seder Adoros. You see what I'm saying? If he said, I already know about that, but I want to find out about the sufferings in Spain, he would get the Shevet Yehuda. If he wanted to know about Tach V'Tat, you get the Yeven Metzulah. If you want to know about other exeros from the Middle Ages, you get the Emek HaBacha. Well, he doesn't call the Emek HaBacha for nothing. You see? And so on and so forth. This was the world of our avos when they wanted to confront the past. Now, the reason I'm sharing it with you is every educated Jew who's interested in the past should make it his business to go through these books at one time or another. You don't have to be a PhD in history to do this. And they are by no means the final word in Jewish history. There's a lot more information out there, especially nowadays, right? But the same way, a person should be familiar with the Seal Sharmi. There are certain books you should be familiar with as part of being a broad, kind of a Torah education. So in the history department, these were the books of the quote-unquote broad Torah education of Once Upon a Time. Armed with this knowledge, then you read other more modern historical studies, you're bringing in a certain grounding. You can say, oh, this is different than what Josephus says, or it's the same, or not, or whatever. Or after you read Josephus, you see Josephus inside, or you see some of these more modern treatments. Now that we have the internet, so you have even more stuff available to you. But the same way you don't want to see from Kli Sheni, you have from Kli Rishon. All these books that I mentioned now are Kli Rishons. Now, I'll say it again. This is not comprehensive. And one of the things that comes to mind, but I don't want to get bogged down in this, are the famous travelogues. There's famous Jewish travelers like you've heard of Binyamin Mitudela and Psachia Regensburg. Those are other historical sources. Accurate, more accurate, less accurate. Shedah is a book like that. But as far as straightforward history and historical chronicles, what I gave you today is a pretty good reading list if you're interested in pursuing this on your own. So that's what I want to say today. It is the yahrzeit of one of them, of the author of the Yeven Metzulah, but he's famous for being a member of this tribe that I just mentioned. The Yeven Metzulah author didn't write any famous farm on Gemara or anything like that. He's famous for history, see? But from history. There's no question over here that when they see the exeris and suffering in the past, they locate it within the framework of God. Why is Hashem doing this? So these are historical as well as meta-historical. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Again, I want to thank Henry Rosenberg and sponsoring. And maybe some of you will be inspired or moved by this to check out one of these titles that I mentioned this morning. With that, I wish you all a good week.